Hi everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the UK PONI Annual Conference and this session on technology and communication for future nuclear threats. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today, wherever you are in the world. I was going to say good afternoon, but that only applies to me, I suppose, in London, and I imagine there are people from all over the world joining us today. We've got a great session lined up for you today. We've got 3 great talks with 4 speakers. So one of them is going to be double teaming, I think, in the last of the talks that we'll have today. It falls to me to just give you a brief introduction to the speakers and just to set out how this session is going to work. So the 3 speakers that we have for you today are Matt Budsworth, who's going to be talking about replacement warhead deterrence without detonation, Mary Hood, who's going to tell us about the criticality of discourse in determinations of nuclear arsenal credibility under the CTBT, and George Parkes and Joseph Campion, who are going to talk to us about a quantum state of mind, threats posed by BoseEinstein condensate gravity sensors. And yeah, they will need to double team that one. I think it sounds pretty complicated. So just as a brief introduction to each of the speakers, Matt Budsworth is a nuclear treaty verification team leader at AWE. He graduated from Manchester University with a master's in physics before joining AWE as a radiation effects scientist. Mary Hood is a 2nd lieutenant in the US Air Force and a 2020 Marshall Scholar, and she's currently studying actually for a master's in science and international security at King's College London, and before that had a background in robotics and autonomous quadrotours. I can't say that properly this time of the day. We then have George Parkes, who graduated with a master's in physics from University of Bath in 2016, and George has worked as a performance and effectiveness assessment analyst at MASS since 2017, and Joe Campion graduated with a master's in astrophysics from Cardiff University in 2014, and he's been at MASS since 2014 and currently works as a mathematical modeler. So a great array of speakers for you today. So before I hand over to the speakers, just to let you know how this is going to work, each presenter will talk for about 12 minutes or so, and we're going to do the Q&A session at the end of after all the speakers have finished talking. However, if I could really encourage all of you to use the Q&A function that you can see on your screens to just tap in any comments and questions as we go ahead, then this will make sure you don't forget one of your questions and also enable us to watch the questions as they come in, so I can field them at the end with the Q&A session, and we can deal with your questions and rather than just listening to my questions, of which I'm sure I'll have many for the speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the first of our speakers, Matt. So Matt, if you would like to queue up your slides. And as I said earlier on, Matt's talk is going to be on replacement warhead deterrence without detonation. Matt.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi guys, Matt Budsworth, from AWE. I'm going to talk to you today about replacement warhead deterrence without detonation. I'm not going to jump into too much detail right here and now about how the talk's going to play out. What I'm going to do instead is go straight into the intro and outline the question that I think is important and why I think it's important. A quick disclaimer that these views are my own, and this talk was created for UK PONI, and my views do not represent AWE, the Ministry of Defence, or the UK government. And with that, we'll jump straight in. So, 1945. Hiroshima, and this was the moment that the world became keenly aware of the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Over the next 75 years, a handful of nations developed the capability and did thousands of tests above ground and underground to certify the safety, performance, and reliability of their nuclear warheads and hone what we know today as modern day deterrence. A secondary effect, however, of performing these tests was also a clear demonstration of nuclear weapon capability. In 1996, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty opened up for signature. This is a picture here of the international monitoring system that supports the CTBT. And the CTBT effectively ended full-scale nuclear testing. But clearly, beyond 1996, nuclear deterrence still has to endure, but without the ability to show and demonstrate nuclear capability. What does that mean for deterrence? Well, we've got to jump into what deterrence is first. And so for a deterrence to be successful, it must satisfy 3 criteria, and that is capability. So a state must be technically capable of carrying out the threat. They must be credible. The resolve of the possessor state must be believable, and it must be communicated. The intent of the possessor state has to be communicated. So the inability to perform full-scale nuclear tests affects one of these in particular, and that is capability, as it no longer allows states to clearly demonstrate their nuclear warhead capability. So through to modern day now, we're moving towards, the UK are moving towards replacement warhead, and moving from a system designed and put into service prior to the CTBT to one done in an era of no full-scale nuclear testing. So the exam question is this, the question I'm posing in this talk is this: absent full-scale nuclear testing, can the UK's adversaries and allies remain reassured of its nuclear capabilities as we move to a product put into service without full-scale nuclear testing? And with that, I'm just going to explore a couple of key themes that I think are really important around this. The first off is science-based certification. So this is what we do at AWE, and it's basically replicating all the things that you would do in a full-scale nuclear test. So you're certifying the safety, reliability, and performance of your warheads, but you're doing it without full-scale nuclear testing. So that's through research and design facilities, development facilities, it's through computational models, it's through doing small-scale tests to underpin the physics, the engineering, the material science, everything that goes into the warhead. And this all goes behind the scenes at AWE, but how can we use this to demonstrate capability? Well, by its nature, the science-based certification approach has to maintain a high level of opacity due to the sensitive and proliferative information. But that doesn't mean we can't put any of the information out. Here is a screenshot of a paper published recently in October 2020 by some AWE colleagues about how to do some of the aspects of science-based certification. So we can publish some of the work. The question is, can we publish technical work in a strategic way? Are there messages that we want to put out that we want other states to know that we can manage by putting out strategically managed technical publications? If we can't reveal all the details of our science-based certification program, can we release the details of the drivers and the requirements of that program? So our understanding of the threat environment, such that allies and adversaries understands that we know the threats and we're addressing them. The second point I'm going to talk about is the CTBT. What does the UK's commitment to the CTBT mean? Well, if we stay committed to the CTBT, that clearly demonstrates that we have confidence in our own science-based certification approach, that we're able to do, that we're able to certify warheads and certify our stockpile without a need for full-scale nuclear testing. Adversely, if we went against the CTBT and made a return to testing, does that undermine our scientific credibility by saying that actually we didn't understand what we're doing and we need to return to testing? We could also explore the benefits and drawbacks of putting out an official statement to the effect of, we do not need to perform nuclear tests. It might have the effect of putting out confidence, additional confidence in our own science-based certification program. The next part is collaboration. Under the 1958 NDA, the UK and the US are allowed to exchange nuclear material, technology, and information. And this is essentially a form of peer review, which is a widely accepted method of providing credibility. We're also able to share resources, facilities, and research, all the things that underpin the science-based certification approach and allow us to put into service nuclear weapons without full-scale testing. The last thing I'm going to come on to is infrastructure and investment. Here is a screenshot of an Economist article, clearly not favourable for the UK and for AWE. But my point here is that nobody talks about a job well done. And it's only the challenging infrastructure projects that create headlines like this. And in the short term, that is all they do. They just create headlines. It's only in the long term, lack of investment or lack of infrastructure investment, lack of investment from the government, there where adversarial states or ally states might begin to question the UK's own capabilities here. Clearly, there is incentive to manage our investments well, to provide and demonstrate domestic value for money. But in the terms of perception of capability, I think it's only in the long-term lack of investment where we risk reputational damage. But does any of that matter? I would argue that the UK has credibility by default. We have a long history of doing this. We have a mature capability, and the UK has continued to invest in its weapons program for 70 years. And I posit that no ally or adversary is going to perform its military calculus on the assumption that the UK does not have nuclear weapons. That is way too risky, and even going forward to a replacement warhead, I believe that the UK maintain credibility by default. So in conclusion, I think without serious reputational damage, I think we maintain that credibility. No state is going to assume that the UK doesn't have the capability to manufacture UK warheads without serious reputational damage. However, the 4 points I outlined, I think, are really important key points to be aware of, and areas in which we may be able to contribute to perceptions of UK capability. And that is in the technical credibility of the UK science-based certification approach, and how we can potentially bolster it by strategically managed publications. The second one is our commitment to the CTBT and how it demonstrates our confidence in our own ability to certify current and replacement warhead. We could also explore the benefits of making an official statement, as I previously stated. The third point is to continue to collaborate with the US under the 1958 NDA and communicate the benefits and the nature of the agreement and the peer review nature of the relationship there. And the last one is continuing to invest sufficiently in the weapons program. Only long-term lack of investment here is going to start to jeopardize or damage perceptions of UK capability. And with that, that's the end of the talk. I'm going to leave it there. And thank you for listening.
That's fantastic, Matt. Thank you so much for that talk and for keeping to time. Just a reminder for everybody, the Q&A function, please, this is a good time to reflect on what you've just heard over the last few minutes and to put some comments and questions with respect to this specific speaker in case you might forget them later on. We'll move on swiftly then to our second speaker for today, for this session, and that's Mary Hood. So Mary, I'll hand over to you. I can see your slides are all queued up. Thanks, Mary.
Great, thank you. As was said, I'm Mary Hood, and today I'll be presenting my research on the criticality of discourse in determinations of nuclear arsenal credibility under the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Quick outline, I'll be going over the context for my research, my argument, and the underlying theory, some relevant examples, and then wrapping up with implications and policy recommendations. So the context for my research is really kind of a convergence of a few factors, and that would be this year we're entering into the 25th anniversary of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and despite not being ratified, as we know, all recognized nuclear weapons states have adhered to it, which means that we're sort of seeing an aging out of test era warheads as well as test experienced scientists. And this is coupling with the US and the UK's decision to start what's arguably their first new warhead design in the test ban era, and that's that W93 project as named by the US. So given this context, my argument is that nuclear test moratoria may compromise domestic determinations of nuclear arsenal credibility, with my focus here really being on that credibility of capability by exacerbating the effects of subjective discourse between technical experts and policymakers, So fundamentally, I'm just arguing that the test ban sort of erodes that empirical truth that grounds discussion, and therefore leaves that interface between technical experts and policymakers more vulnerable to the effects of subjective discourse. And I'm not necessarily advocating for return to test, and I want to say that up front, but rather recognizing that there's unique issues that testing bans create that have to be considered. And I'm personally really interested in this topic because of my own interest in how human factors affect technical institutions, and the nuclear enterprise is a particularly interesting case study of this. So the underlying theory for my research is the principal agent theory, which was originally founded in economics, and addresses any relationship in which there's a knowledge gap or an information asymmetry. So a really relatable example would be patient-doctor relationships. So in my research, although there is some duality between who's the principal and who the agent is, my focus is on policymakers as our principal, who then delegate work to our agent, in this case, technical experts, so weapons labs, who then use their unique skill sets and expertise to further the interests of our principal. But because of this information asymmetry in which the policymakers tend to lack the same knowledge and expertise as our technical experts, we see a couple different issues that are described in the theory. First is adverse selection, in which the principal lacks the knowledge to both choose the best agent for the job, but also generally to choose the best budgets and programs and proposals brought forward. And the second is known as moral hazard, in which, once again, the principal doesn't necessarily have the expertise needed to truly tell whether the agent is doing their best work to further the principal's interests. And the nuclear enterprise is particularly vulnerable to this issue of information asymmetry, just because of really small communities, niche expertise, and extremely high stakes, as obviously our nuclear programs are a national priority. And then all of this is kind of overlaid by this self-interest that you see within both entities. And that's not necessarily malicious. It's just that different backgrounds and information and needs are going to affect how the principal and the agent interact together. So given all this, it's interesting. We can see how principal agent theory might apply to some examples already within the last 25 years of the nuclear enterprise. And in my research, I've categorized the effects of this information asymmetry and the subjective discourse into three broad categories, which is financial, cultural, and political. And I'll now go into a couple examples of each. So first, financially, the United Kingdom's atomic weapons establishment has been under private ownership for the past couple decades, and that is changing this year as the government moves to renationalize. But when you're under private ownership, there's inherently going to be a loyalty to shareholders and a profit focus that's going to affect those interactions with policymakers and drive budgetary and program decisions, again, not necessarily maliciously, but just inherently by the nature of being a private organization. And then the United States, after testing ended, they introduced the Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program. And a lot of lab directors vehemently disagreed with the decision to end testing, but accepted stockpile stewardship, seeing it as their only route to funding. And so we can see that quote from then Director of Energy saying that a lot of weapons labs saw their choices either funding with stockpile stewardship or no funding at all. So a lot accepted programs that they didn't necessarily think was in the best interest of the nuclear enterprise for financial reasons. Next, we see some cultural examples. One that I think is particularly interesting is the technical community's own description of their knowledge. So in the early days of the testing ban, a lot of members in the technical community argued that they couldn't do their job without testing. And this is, when it became evident that that was politically infeasible, this has since changed to recognize the importance and the usage of alternatives such as simulations and experiments. And that was sort of to maintain relevance within this new testing ban era. And then again, the US looked at two different programs for maintaining nuclear reliability after testing. And as we saw in the previous slide, they went with stockpile stewardship. And this program was developed by managers and policymakers whose belief was that the underpinning of reliability and credibility was really in the individual technical expertise of scientists. And this contrasts with the reliable replacement Warhead program, which was actually developed by the technical community, whose underpinning belief was that credibility really came from the design and makeup of individual warheads in the stockpile. And so they advocated for the designing and building of new warheads. So we see an interesting divergence in what different entities thought was best for the nuclear program based off of different cultural backgrounds. And then finally, political discourse. And this can be kind of one of the areas where it sort of flip-flops and technical experts are occasionally at an information disadvantage. But here, very obvious, especially in the United States, that policy changes with different administrations. We saw this very starkly with President Obama, who had a clear no testing, no new design policy, compared to President Trump, who reopened the possibility of testing and also introduced a variety of programs such as the W93. Another interesting one we see in the 1990s, one of the staunchest supporters of the RRW was actually House Representative Hobson, but not because he was interested in the RRW, but rather he saw it as an opportunity to divert funding away from programs he disagreed with. And then finally, the US has expressed confidence that they'll be able to start producing 80 plutonium pits per year by 2030. And this has been questioned even by federally funded R&D organizations. So again, we sort of see this divergence from what the technical community thinks is feasible and from what's being stated politically by the National Nuclear Security Administration. So given this, what are the implications for the nuclear programs? And of course, this information asymmetry and this influence of subjective discourse didn't suddenly appear with the testing ban. It was present prior to this. But my argument is that the testing ban just exacerbates this issue because we no longer have that empirical truth that everyone can tell what a successful test means. And so without this, I argue that accurate assessments of reliability are more difficult, and short-term risks include things like ineffectual budgeting, poor time management, and miscommunications. But these could potentially compound and get us further and further away from those accurate assessments, creating potentially destabilizing miscalculations in the long term. Therefore, I have three broad policy recommendations that are in line with the principal agent theory, particularly as espoused by Peter Fever for civil-military relations. And the first is screening and selection. So broadly, investing in more multidisciplinary education and allowing people with STEM backgrounds to take on public policy programs and vice versa. And I think higher education is getting better at this. And then internally, improving talent management. I think it's a perennial problem for governments to maintain talent within civil service. And I know that this has been a complaint within the nuclear organization to some extent. So managing that. A slightly more intrusive form of control and monitoring by the principal can be fire alarms, which in the traditional theory is third parties such as watchdogs or journalists, but this isn't particularly viable in the nuclear enterprise just because of security and classification. So in a slight expansion of the theory, I actually propose internal alarms, which would basically be atypical events that trigger further investigation. And arguably the United Kingdom has already done this, at least informally, as a lot of opinion pieces speculate that some of the reason to renationalize the AWE included safety incidents and fiscal mismanagement. So I propose the institutionalization of these quote unquote fire alarms. And then finally, police patrols, which tend to be the most intrusive, such as standing neutral oversight committees, which again is arguably the role that the recently stood up UK Defence Nuclear Organization fills, as well as regular audits and reports. So taking a focus with the UK, I think that they're incredibly well positioned right now to really consider the unique problems that testing bans create and mitigate those effects. And I argue that because of the restructuring that we're seeing right now with the renationalization of the AWE and the recent stand-up of the Defense Nuclear Organization and its continued expansion within the past 6 years. So as they do this, I just advocate that policies and committees and decisions are implemented thoughtfully and consider the effects of subjective discourse and try to ensure that as accurate as possible of assessments of reliability are made into the foreseeable future. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic stuff, Mary. Thank you. Lots of things there for people to deliberate on, and I can already see some questions and comments flowing in. So please do keep those going. let's move on swiftly then to the final talk of this session before we move into the Q&A part, where we can actually get some of these questions to our speakers. So George Parks and Joseph Campion are up next. And as I mentioned before, a quantum state of mind, threats posed by Bose-Einstein condensate gravity sensors is their topic. So if we could have their slides queued up, please, and I'll hand over to George and Joe.
Okay, so yep, my name is Joseph Campion. I'll be presenting a quantum state of mind, threats posed by Bose-Einstein condensate gravity sensors, alongside my colleague George Parks. Next slide, please. So just a disclaimer, so the views represented in this presentation are ours and do not represent those of MASS or the Submarine Delivery Agency. This presentation represents a topic of interest, and neither of us directly work on this technology. Next slide. So what will we be covering in this presentation? So I'll start off by giving a brief introduction to quantum phenomena, going through the key characteristics of a quantum system. Having done that, I'll then move on to defining what a Bose-Einstein condensate is, and then its applications in gravitational sensors. I will then pass on to George, who will then talk about the further applications of this technology. Next slide. So quantum phenomena. So one of the key concepts in quantum phenomena is something known as wave-particle duality, and it really is what it says in the tin. It's the ability for a quantum system to behave both as a particle and a wave, as depicted in the top image to the right. And as a result of that, you have something known as wave functions and quantum interference. Now, typically these are more easily understood mathematically, but I'm going to give you sort of more of an analogy on this, where you consider throwing a pebble into a lake and the ripples that causes. So you can think of the wave functions being described by the ripples in the lake. And then when thinking of interference, you can think of maybe more than one pebble being thrown into a lake, where the interference is where those ripples cross over and interact with one another. The bottom image to the right is again kind of reinforces this. So you have the classical image of the atom, where you have the nucleus and the electron orbiting it, the same way the moon orbits the Earth. And then to the right, you've got a quantum representation, which is better understood through statistical behavior. The concept that's useful to understand for this presentation is something known as a ground state, or a state of lowest energy. So it's the lowest energy state that can be occupied in a quantum system from atoms. Bosons are a particular classification of particle, and they're of particular relevance when considering this phenomena. Next slide, please. So what is a Bose-Einstein condensate? So typically you have four states of matter. Those are solids, liquids, gases, and plasmas. A Bose-Einstein condensate is a fifth state of matter, which exists by lowering the temperature to temperatures of almost absolute zero, hence extreme circumstances that create this form of matter, which I'll build on more in the next slide. Next slide, please. So initially proposed in 1924 by Sachendra Nath Bose to Albert Einstein, it ended up winning a Nobel Prize in the year 2001. So how do you get to a Bose-Einstein condensate? So it starts off by having a boson gas, which, as previously mentioned, is sufficiently cooled to very, very low temperatures of absolute zero. And at that point, where you would have initially had a distribution of particles and atoms that existed in multiple energy states, then they end up residing in a single ground state together. So it's kind of concentrating all those atoms into a single state. At this point, what you have is where quantum effects were happening on a very, very small scale, they then start exhibiting effects where you can view it on the macroscopic scale. So the image to the right is demonstrating how you get from a boson gas to a Bose-Einstein condensate. So the image to the left shows a large distribution of energy levels, and then the far right image is once it's been sufficiently cooled, and then they all reside in a single ground state. Next slide, please. So how is this used in the real world? So there is something called a gravimeter, which is a gravitational reading device. So what it does is it looks at the surface of the Earth and around the surface of the Earth, and it can take relative measurements of the gravitational force and acceleration. And this is really useful for identifying characteristics of the Earth's surface. Not all of them, but in this particular case, a Bose-Einstein condensate can be used to take these measurements. So how it starts off with is a chip-based device where a boson gas is then cooled to temperatures of almost absolute zero, forming a Bose-Einstein condensate. Those atoms are then released in free fall in this device in a vacuum chamber, where you have interference as a result of the different atoms or the wave functions intersecting one another. And at this point, what you get are acceleration readings from that. Hence, you can get local gravity readings as well. This is a highly accurate device and it's still being developed. And their size is also of importance as well. So it's not necessarily a massive device that has to be built. They can be the same size as a backpack. And they can be more accurate than other conventional gravity sensors. So I'll be passing on to George Parks now, who will talk to you more about the further applications of this technology.
Next slide, please. Okay, so as with any new piece of sensing technology, there's obviously a variety of different use cases. So the two reports or the two reviews we've got there. Last year, the EU Commission released a review looking at particularly these cold atom interferometers. So it's a paper that's designed to sort of help policymakers in space and other areas, but it focuses on kind of the whole range of spectrum, the whole spectrum of implications. And in 2014, there was a DSTL quantum landscape review that kind of looked at a whole host of different quantum technologies, from this particular technology to quantum computing. And Bose-Einstein condensate gravity sensors represent one of the quantum technologies which is likely to see sort of operational deployment significantly sooner than things like quantum computers. So they're both an interesting review. The things that we want to focus on for the rest of this pitch are starting off with a gravity map. So if you've got a gravitational sensor, you can use it to create an accurate gravity map of the surface of the Earth. So it's useful for trajectory modeling for ballistic systems. And then kind of the threats piece that we wanted to kind of focus on is using these things to detect either underground targets like a bunker, or the potential of detecting underwater targets for something like a submarine. You can also use these in inertial navigation systems as accelerometers, but whilst it's an interesting topic, we're not going to focus on that too much here. So next slide, please. Okay, so hopefully everyone's aware that the Earth isn't a perfect sphere. There's mountains and troughs and variations in the thickness of the crust and large mineral deposits. All these things contribute to sort of a fluctuating gravitational field as you move around the planet. So that the sort of image on the right is hopefully illustrates that. In order to model a ballistic system, which obviously most of the deployed nuclear weapon systems that exist today are, you need to take account of that local gravity field. When you've launched a system, as it's re-entering in a ballistic phase, it will get little tugs up, down, left, right, depending on the local gravity, and that can contribute to a weapon system inaccuracy. So if you can take account for that, you can have a more accurate system. So the better your gravity readings, the more accurate you can target your system. Obviously, beyond a certain threshold, you'll have other sources of errors that will contribute more. But this is kind of the coarsest level with a decent sensor. What can you do? Okay, so next slide, please. So if you've got a really precise sensor, can you use it to look for smaller things? So rather than looking for sort of large mineral deposits or mountains, can you use it to detect something much smaller, or the absence of something? So in this case, we might be talking about a bunker or a missile silo, whether that silo contains a missile or not. So the image on the right is kind of a very basic representation of if you were to pass a gravity sensor in a sort of one-dimensional environment over the top of an area where there's a bunker. If there's a large hole in the ground, then you'll get a small drop in the local gravitational field or measurements. So obviously in reality, you'll have all sorts of noise over the top of this, but as a basic representation, that's what we want to look at. In reality, you'd use this in conjunction with all sorts of other systems. So whether you'd use aerial photography, you might want to identify an area with radar, LiDAR. But the key difference with gravity, one is it's passive. So whoever you're looking at shouldn't be able to know that unless they physically see you there with a gravity sensor, they're not going to know that you're there taking readings from their facility. And the other big thing is that unlike things like photography or EM, we don't have the ability to manipulate gravity in the same way we do with EM. So it should be unspoofable, at least to a high level. So next slide, please. So this isn't a new concept, using gravity to detect things like this, underground voids. It's existed for over a decade. Lockheed had a project looking for underground tunnels. So the image on the right is kind of one of their pieces. And as you can see, there's levels of noise when you get there. So why are we talking about it? It's not new. So what difference does a Bose-Einstein condensate make? And as Joe said earlier, these are very, very accurate systems, sort of an order of magnitude increase of precision versus a traditional sensor. So you can either detect things that are significantly smaller, or with the sort of order of magnitude increase in precision, you could increase the range to detect the same type of object by around 3 times. So the implications of this are obviously in an intelligence round. If you can get better information on underground facilities that you might want to target, you can target your weapons better, and potentially, if you have higher level of certainty that you're going to be able to destroy that facilities, you might be able to use less weapons to do that, which obviously is a good thing. So next slide, please. So okay, so if you can use it to detect things underground, can you use it to detect things underwater? So again, you need to kind of move even further along that level of precision. Again, Lockheed Martin already advertised the use of gravitational systems in submarines. Primarily, it's for navigation and collision avoidance. Again, detecting things like large mountains, and you can avoid those. But would you be able to detect something as small as a submarine? It's very difficult under normal operating under normal operating considerations. A submarine should be neutrally buoyant, so the mass of the submarine should be equal to the mass it's displaced in the water. So on the low, if you've got a low resolution sensor, you're not going to be able to see that. If you've got a very high resolution sensor, you could start looking for anomalies because of the discrepancy between the water, the metal hull, and the area inside. So the problem with this is because it's such small variations, you'd have a very limited range. So it's not something you could put in orbit in a satellite to look for. Though if you were to couple it with other ways of detecting where you might be likely to find a submarine, it's something you could use to passively track stealth assets. So obviously there is the threat there. So and because of the physical size, maybe it's something you could put into a small drone that could follow a submarine round, passively tracking it. So next slide, please. So hopefully there's a little bit of an overview. So the main piece is that this is a reliability detection piece. And I think the key other aspect is that it is unspoofable versus other forms of intelligence gathering. And so if you've got on both sides, whether it's underground or underwater, if you've got a better ability to find things, you've got a better ability to target them and potentially hit them and neutralize them. So there are obviously implications to sort of deterrent regimes. But based on the current level of technology, I don't think the threat is overly significant, but it's something that's interesting and worth thinking about. So hopefully being able to give you a little bit of an intro to some quantum theory, a bit about Bose-Einstein condensates, so using gravity sensors, their use cases, and kind of what the threat level is. Next slide, please. And that's all we have. So a nice image of Bose on the left and Einstein on the right, and their proposed state of matter in the middle. Thank you.